Welcome to Bart and Tart Talk About Art.
Bling, 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 bling.
Hello, Mr. Eric.
Hello, Mr. Smile.
Today we talk about a very special painting, we always
only talk about special paintings. Yes.
Only talk about special paintings. Yeah. What are we going to talk about today, Eric?
Well, we were debating that a little bit, weren't we? Because we wanted to talk about some El Greco, also known as Dominicus Theotokopoulos, I think. That was his actual name, as I understand. He was a Greek artist working in Spain, as I recall. Like around the 16th and 17th centuries.
Yes.
And we were talking a little bit about which painting to go with, because the thing is that we kind of both, maybe our favorite Greco painting is View of Toledo, which is this this amazing, landscape painting. I'm a little bit unfocused right now, I apologize. Landscape painting with this magnificent dramatic sky over it. But also, I was thinking we could talk about, and I think that is what we will talk about, his painting of the Annunciation. Maybe he did several paintings of the Annunciation, who knows. But the reason why it might be interesting to talk about this one is that it's more, it's more clearly an example of what is called Mannerism or the Mannerist Style. And I thought that might be interesting to talk a little bit about. So, for those who are not as deeply religious as you and I, Smau, the Annunciation is...
What are you talking about, Eric? I am deeply religious.
That's what I'm saying, but I'm just saying I want to explain it to, if we have any listeners who are not as pious as we are, the Annunciation...
Eric.
Yes. The Annunciation is the point at which Archangel Gabriel, I think... announces to the Virgin Mary that even though she is a virgin, she will bear the Son of God soon. And so that is the moment we see in the painting. Clearly, we see Gabriel is the dude in the green dress down there. And he is sort of explaining to her how it's all going to go down. And because this is such a momentous occasion, of course, after all, it's the Son of God that is being announced or announced. We have like a whole band of angels up in the sky just like rocking out to celebrate the occasion. I jest, but I do really like El Greco's style in general. And that style is what is has come to be known as the Mannerist style, and it's sort of been ultimately used as in a positive way and as a pejorative term, as as a critique. And I think a mannerism, when you use that word in English now, it tends to be something people do that's sort of a little bit artificial, a little bit fake, a little bit annoying, maybe. He has a strange mannerism of doing this or that, right? And the thing is that the Mannerist art style sort of came on the heels of the Renaissance, and the Renaissance artists were all about sort of recapturing what they saw as classical Greek and Roman art's virtues, which were the accurate and sort of very dignified and sort of stable representation of scenes from, back then it was mythology, and of course in the Renaissance it was biblical scenes almost always, because I think when we talk about art from this period, we're talking about religious art.
In the Renaissance?
In the Renaissance and in the Mannerist period, a lot of it is religious art, right?
In the Renaissance, actually, you have a lot of paintings that are famous ones that are not. You can say that they're religious, but they're not Catholic. For example, The Birth of Venus.
That's true. Yeah. That's true. They dug into Botticelli. They dug into the Greek mythology and stuff like that.
Exactly.
That is
There's
true.
also another famous painting that I don't know who made it. It's like philosophers talking. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's like
Possibly.
Greek philosophers talking, and that's the painting.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
there are some from Renaissance that are
yeah,
not like Catholic themed,
that is
but you're
true.
right. I think overall they're mostly Catholic themed.
And it is interesting just because the church was such a big part of public life back then. I am curious now as to whether they would reframe something as, for instance, the painting, Botticelli's painting of Venus, as somehow being a symbol of the love of, like, if they would sort of integrate that into like a Christian kind of message as well. I don't know about that, but anyway, but anyway, so Mannerism sort of came on the heels of the Renaissance and that focus on portraying bodies and architecture, etc., sort of faithfully. And what Mannerism did was they sort of broke with that a little bit, and they said, well, that's all fine and good, but we want to create something that's expressive. So they tended towards compositions that were dynamic, that was sort of unstable, and they would distort the human figure in different ways. So, and we can see evidence of this on this painting as well. Very long limbs, and sort of a stylized approach to figure painting, right? And Greco had that, and his figures are very recognizable. So where in Renaissance, you could argue that it was not about having a style; it was about being faithful to what you were depicting. In Mannerism, it becomes more about style, and I think that's an interesting break, and I think it's kind of an ebb and flow that you see throughout art history from the Renaissance forwards until modernism, essentially, is that you have these movements that try to crank up expression and drama and action, basically, and then you have these movements that go back towards something that's more classical, that's more sort of accurate representation, stable depictions of and you can sort of say, you can take all like representations of the Last Supper, for instance, and you can have Baroque
Yeah.
paintings that are sort of they're angled, they're from a seen from like a 3/4 view, and there's people are doing all kinds of shit. And then you can have the more classical representation where the table is arranged in front of you and you see them all lined up there, and every detail is clear, etc., etc., etc. So it's kind of
Yeah.
two conceptions of what paintings are supposed to do, right? Are they supposed to convey the impact of something, or are they supposed to
Yeah.
show you what it looked like? And of course, they both kind of traditions do that in different ways, but it's kind of where you put the accent, right?
I think that also shows how society works, right? Because it goes through conservative periods and then more radical
Hmm.
periods, right?
Yeah.
So I think in painting that shows,
Yeah, to be sure.
I would say that
To be sure.
more like conservative, like in the case of Renaissance, more the stability and all of that, and then on Mannerism more like style and flashy and more art as more of a manifestation of the painter himself, right, or herself.
Sure. Yeah.
More like that. Yeah.
But of course, I'm not sure that necessarily, the Renaissance represented sort of stability. I think the Renaissance was a very revolutionary, movement
Oh
of its
yes,
time, right?
it was.
And likewise, I guess there have probably been periods in art history where very dramatic art was created, and it was kind of maybe even sort of seen as opium for the masses or something like, entertainment to. I'm not sure it's necessarily progressive versus traditional, but it definitely is sort of a pendulum that swings, to be sure. And the
Yeah.
Mannerists were sort of were the first, were at least some of the first to sort of take this renewed focus on realist painting that came with the Renaissance, and then twist that into something more expressive. And I think, as we've established before, We love stuff that's expressive in different ways,
Yeah.
and that's why something like this is fun. I think so. When we look at the painting, like I
Yeah, I
love
think so.
I love the band of angels up there. I love
Mhm.
just the sky. And the other painting I mentioned, View of Toledo, that has the most amazing dramatic sky. One of the most amazing dramatic skies in art history, basically. And the sky here is super sort of tempestuous and wild, right?
Yeah.
And then also there's elements of this painting that I'm just not sure. I would love for you to tell me what are these sort of weird sort of round shapes that are sort of over the head of the Virgin Mary. Sort of there's like a passage from the
Oh
Virgin
yeah.
Mary into the dove up there. The dove symbolizes Jesus, as I recall, from
The
my
Holy Spirit.
long religious training. The Holy Spirit,
Yeah.
of course, it's the Holy Spirit. You're right. You're right. I apologize. But these sort of bulbous shapes, I'm not sure what they are. I mean, if they're flower buds
Ah,
or I don't know.
yeah, it can be wheat. Wheat.
Could be. Could
I
be.
don't know either.
Yeah, maybe that
But
has
it
some.
can be grapes,
Yeah, grapes. Yeah, that's a
like
good.
gigantic grapes,
Yeah.
gigantic wheats,
Yeah, I don't know. I don't
or
know.
clouds. I think, yeah, and I think that's what I think what I like about this painting is the
Mm,
abstract character of it, because that's the thing, those things, they're very abstract.
right.
The same with the clouds. The clouds, they look more like cotton candy. They're not very. The edges are not very well defined.
No. No.
It has a lot of elements, like the wings, the way the wings of the angels are drawn are so with such a few strokes, not very well defined, just defined enough for us to understand what they are, but it leaves a lot of room for, I don't know, for a bit more of interpretation, I would say. I mean, of formal interpretation, right? Those
Yeah.
that There's a lot of black and all of it around the wings.
Mm,
So I like that touch of abstractionism way, way, way before abstractionism was a thing.
of course. Yeah, yeah.
So
And I think that, and it's a fun painting to look at because it really, I mean, and this is the Mannerist style. It really insists on not being in balance, basically. So there's
yeah,
this sort of you have the Virgin Mary in the lower left corner, and then above her is the angel. And then the choir of angels starts top left and sort of moves into the right. So there's this like you can sort of there's this path through the picture that your eyes take, which is just very pleasing to sort of explore this image. But yeah, then there's also, I mean, and I think what the stuff that we're not sure what is, and that's where research might have come into the picture, of course. But we don't do too much research because that's boring, right?
exactly.
It's much more fun to just look at things and then make up your own mind about them, right? Um,
Exactly.
but also, there's that
I
stuff.
mean, and people that do research, I bet sometimes they do the same. So
Of
who
course,
cares?
of course, who cares? No, but I mean, I think also with part of the fun of if I'm gonna defend our laziness here, part of the fun of looking at an old painting like this and then just sort of going with your gut feeling about it, is
Yeah.
also that it sort of it estranges you from it a little bit in a way, or distances you from it in a way that's interesting. It's interesting to try and engage with something that's very old, just on a gut level, I think, because the research can also remove you a little bit from like what do you actually feel about this, right? I also think it's fun. I mean, I don't know if the angels sort of gave the Virgin Mary like a very weird kind of bouquet or whatever that is on the ground between them. Um,
Yeah.
and she's standing
I
next to a pulpit of some kind, it seems, which is also unusual to
Yeah,
me.
it seems like she's in a church. No, I think she was probably reading the Bible. She has a book
Ah,
on the desk.
right. So she has a very tall reading table.
Exactly. She was reading the Bible because, she's Virgin Mary. She
Of
does
course, of
nothing but
course.
reading the Bible, even though when she was born, I mean, when this would happen, probably the Bible would not exist because the Bible only exists after Jesus.
I guess the Old Testament was there in some form,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. The Old Testament. So probably she's reading the Old Testament.
Yeah, yeah.
Was she didn't have Vogue magazine. She didn't have
No, no, no,
those
no.
things to read. That was the entertainment that she had available.
Yes.
Uh,
Poor
and
girl.
and I think the strange thing that is the kind of the tree because it's like leaves burning right
Right. I guess so. Yeah, you're right.
beneath her,
Yeah.
and I think there is, I don't know if you've watched The Prince of Egypt from DreamWorks.
Now you're throwing some very academic references at me. I actually never have watched that one.
Exactly.
I never did watch
You
that
have
one.
never watched it?
No,
Okay,
no.
great film. I recommend. Anyway, in there appears. It's based on Prince of Egypt, which is a biblical tale.
Right.
And there is this thing that I don't remember the word in English, but it's kind of a tree that is burning, and then Moses sees the tree burning, and he talks with the tree because the tree is like God, something along those lines.
The burning bush. As I
Exactly,
recall,
the burning bush. So I guess probably that's the burning bush there, that it's a manifestation of God, I'm guessing.
Could be. Yeah. Yeah, that makes
But
sense.
otherwise, I don't remember that when she saw the angels, there was a burning bush in that passage.
No,
But then
no.
again, I didn't read enough of that to know if there was actually a bush burning. That would explain why she saw angels, depending on what kind of bush she was burning.
Yeah.
It was some funny herbs that she was burning.
But it is. I also think that with the corn, if it's corn in the back, or wheat or whatever it is in the background,
Oh, yeah.
I mean that could be some symbol of sort of fertility and growth and that kind of thing. Possibly, right?
Yeah, possibly. Who knows?
Possibly. Another thing that sort of came to mind for me looking at this and sort of thinking about, religious art and a sort of a Renaissance style representation versus a Mannerist, or, the Mannerist movement later turns into the Baroque essentially, right?
Yeah.
Which makes sense. And one thing that's interesting about that is, I think, and again, none of us are religious in any sort of meaningful way. I think I hope it's okay that I speak for you on that one.
Yeah, it's okay.
But I feel like in sort of in religion, there's always this sort of weird or there's this push and pull again, where a lot of religions, or at least the way I think about religions, is that there's sort of codified values within a society in a lot of ways, right? They're sort of what religions are often is like a guide for how to act as a part of a community. And then you have these sort of deities that are like, sort of the guarantors, or they're like often they're of course, or I guess almost always, they're said to have invented the rules for how you're supposed to act. So they're like you have to do it because dad says so, right? That kind of thing. They're the authority sort of enforcing the rules in a way, right? So if you don't follow the rules, things will go badly for you, if not in this life, then in the next. So religions are about creating order in a society often. But then also there's this sort of ecstatic dimension to religions, right? Because religions are about things that are sort of beyond our immediate understanding. They're about kind of magical things in a way, right? They're about awesome angels playing cool instruments, and they're about these like virgins having kids just out of the blue. And there's all this stuff that happens that sort of, I think sparks the imagination in a lot of ways, and sort of that you sort of have to go along with as an adherent to the religion. So I think for like this can create a situation where art on the one hand, religious art on the one hand needs to communicate sort of it needs to reflect, or I think there are periods where it sort of reflects that part of religion which is about the order and which is about everybody in their place in society, and God is why we live in a stable world, and etc. etc. And then there are parts or eras in religious art where there's more focus on the sort of look how amazing and cool this stuff is, and all this stuff really happened, and look, I can do this dramatic painting and I can show you that this amazing thing in the Bible actually happened, where the angel showed up. And I'm reading this comic about American cults at the moment, and it is that thing of you see all through like Christianity that these.
What's the name of the comic, Harry?
It's called American Cults. So it's like an anthology. It just came out with different sort of short comics about different cults. Some of them are very strange indeed. It's pretty fascinating. But these are a lot of these cults are of course religious people that sort of have their own interpretation of the Bible, and then they go off and do their own thing. And in one way, they're like the best Christians ever because they go into it, 110%. But in another way, they're obviously a nuisance to the Christian community because they challenge sort of the order of society, right? So I think I think with religions, there's always this sort of double. It's double-edged sword in a way. Like, let's look at it. Like, pretend you are like a dictator, and this has really happened, right? There was like, if we go way back, just to the first thing that comes to mind, and maybe it's because you said Prince of Egypt. There was this pharaoh called Akhenaton, I think, who was like, out with the old gods. I'm inventing a new god. It's the sun. Everybody worship the sun, right? So that's and it kind of didn't really work, but that's an example of somebody trying to build a state around a religion they designed for that purpose, right? And if that was what you were what you wanted to do, if you wanted to stabilize your society with religion, I mean, I think you would have the challenge of, on one hand, there's like, here's a book and it's all these rules. But the reason you have to follow them is because amazing things exist beyond your understanding. And that is really cool and crazy and wow. And I think that sort of, the cool, crazy, wow thing sort of challenges the orderliness, basically. So it's sort of the ecstatic versus the, versus the norm-based part of religion, which I think is sort of is reflected in these movements of religious art, going from the craziness we see in this. I mean, I think this El Greco painting is pretty crazy. I think for somebody looking at it back then, it must have been mind-blowingly intense, right?
Yeah. I think so too.
And then if you compare
I think it's still mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, it's still pretty mind-blowing, exactly.
I mean, if you compare this painting to all the paintings made in that period, I mean, all the paintings that I've seen, there's nothing like this. Not then, and for centuries afterwards.
Right.
Nothing.
And if you compare something like this to, I think it's Michelangelo's Supper, right? This sort of super orderly, central perspective, everything in its place. It looks like they'll be sitting there for centuries, right? And this is just like so much movement and so much action and so much shit is going on. And I think that's just interesting how that kind of reflects different aspects of religion. Maybe.
Yeah. But I think what's most interesting about it, in the sense that I say that there was nothing like this before and for many centuries after, it's not so much the dynamic part, because as you said, it's part of a movement, Mannerism. There was others that were doing similar things to the bodies, elongating limbs and all of that.
Right.
But for me, what is crazy about it is really the way he uses paint and the way he uses the surface of the painting, because he's not very worried about creating perspective, and all of that is more about flattening.
Yeah,
is that the right word? Yeah, flattening the picture, and for example, the way he uses the blacks, the Caravaggio would also make figures erupt from the darkness, right? Later in Baroque. So that's not something new either, like figures erupting from the darkness, because it seems, just judging by the colors and the way they seem to work, is that the colorful bits were painted on top of just a black background.
Right. Yeah,
that's the feeling that it gives to me.
Yeah, when you look at the top of the image, that's definitely what it feels like. Yeah.
Exactly. So that creates, but maybe other painters would do that as well, but they would then refine it so that the figures would become very three-dimensional, very polished, and it doesn't.
No.
It just gives enough strokes so that people understand that there is a figure there, but it still becomes quite flat. That contrast between the black and the colors, and the way that sometimes, like I was telling about the clouds that are so not defined at all, the edges and all of that it becomes very abstract. It reminds me a little bit of Marc Chagall.
Yeah.
For example,
Yeah,
Marc Chagall would also paint some kind of angels or figures flying, and the colors also remind me a little bit of Marc Chagall, like this bluish tones.
Right.
So it does remind me more of like modern art made in the 20th century,
right,
than stuff made back then in Renaissance or Mannerism, because it's not polished.
No.
It's so rough. It's so rough and tough that it's crazy. I don't know how this guy was accepted. I don't know how he would pay the rent, because it's so far out, so far-fetched from what everyone else seems to be doing.
Right.
That he must have seemed like an alien. I mean, he seems like an alien now from all the other stuff. I don't know how people. I kind of know. I know that the king was not a big fan of his work. Actually, he went to Spain and he wanted to be part of the Spanish court and paint for the king himself. But the king was like, nah, I don't like your stuff. So he stayed in Toledo. So I guess that's a way of understanding that actually he was not very praised. And also in Italy, because he studied in part of his education was in Italy, and in Italy there he had also a lot of critics.
Right.
So yeah, he was an eccentric painter, but somehow he was able to always get commissions, it seems, and survive. And I read somewhere that he had a very kind of luxurious lifestyle. So money would probably flow in.
Right. I think any painter from the 16th century whose work is still preserved today has been regarded as an important figure at some point in the history in between there and then and now, right? Otherwise their paintings probably wouldn't exist now, I would guess.
I don't think so, actually, because there was a lot of like art, because the Renaissance painters were the ones that brought a sense of like of art as something, not as a craft, as like something more elitistic, so to speak, something more of an idea rather than just a craft, just a thing that you use to decorate. It was something that would present ideas and make you think and all of that.
Right.
So with Renaissance painters become known by, I mean, there was also some before, I believe, but it's when the idea of an artist as an author, as somebody that is conveying ideas becomes more popular. But still, there are a lot of I know from the museums in Portugal that there's a lot of when you go to the museums in small towns and even museums in Lisbon, there's a lot of paintings from painters that honestly almost no one cares about, and the paintings look very ugly and very boring, and I think those were just like commissioned to just decorate the church, or go to some family that could pay them, like not the king but some other family that could paint them, could buy them. It was just artisans doing their thing, and somehow they ended up preserved through the centuries just because they're
Yeah.
not very remarkable.
Yeah, but I mean, I have to imagine that a lot of art has been lost in history. But of
Oh, thanks
course,
God.
but
If
but of course,
you
who
know,
knows?
if so much crap survived, I
Yeah.
wonder the crap that didn't survive. That must have been hideous.
Or maybe it was amazing and people just didn't get it. But people
Yeah, or
did.
maybe it was like El Greco's. Yeah, exactly. People that were like really remarkable, but people didn't understand them. Or like Caravaggio,
Mm,
because both El Greco and Caravaggio, they only started being recognized as great painters many centuries afterwards. Or
yeah, I mean,
maybe not many centuries, but at least like a century or two.
yeah, I mean, Caravaggio is somebody I know a little bit more about, and he was very renowned when he was working. But of course, it was for a pretty short period of time. He didn't live very long. But anyway, just one point to attach to the Greco. Also, like where you're talking about the technique, there's a couple of things that are like the way he sort of disregards light and shadow in some cases, like the pulpit
Mhm.
to the left of Virgin Mary, where there are these sort of black spots, and they don't really seem to be shadows from anywhere. They're just kind of,
Yeah,
maybe they're just there to create a balance in the image, but he
exactly.
doesn't care much
And
about
that's
whether they have a sort of a naturalistic reason to be there.
yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to mention was the part of what's so cool about this and what makes it so amazing to look at is how wild the strokes are.
Yeah.
Like that sort of cloud that Gabriel is standing on. Like you can just sort of feel how these sort of tufts of smoke or whatever it is are just sort of whirling around, and in his cloth as well. It looks as if there's just like this storm, like stormy wind right on it, and there's so much movement in his strokes, right? Where I mean, I'm just sort of saying what you said in a kind of slightly different way, where other painters would refine this until it was almost completely stiff.
Yeah.
He stopped at a point where there's still a lot of life in these figures, and that's part of what makes it feel so. I mean, it doesn't feel current. I mean, it would be weird if somebody painted this now.
Yeah.
But it does. I mean, feel timeless maybe in some ways, or
Yeah,
out
I
of
think so
time,
too.
right?
And maybe not painting, but there's still people doing this kind of themes. I don't know if you've seen the David LaChapelle paint photography of Courtney Love holding
Oh
Kurt
yeah,
Cobain
yeah,
dead as
yeah,
Virgin Mary as a Pietà.
yeah,
So these
yeah.
kind of themes are still popping,
Sure.
and I think people still paint this kind of stuff once in a while. And if you see, for example, contemporary churches that have new paintings,
Mm.
they a lot of times resemble this kind of style,
Yeah.
actually.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. But yeah,
And
it's
and
hmm?
and I think the thing that you say that the strokes are not very refined, that you can feel the strokes, it also makes it very contemporary
That's
because
true.
it's the idea of a process,
Yeah.
right? You can see the process, you can
Yeah.
feel the process, and that's a very contemporary idea that comes from, I think, the performance art and that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
That the process becomes part of the final piece, and as important or even more important than the final work. So that also
Right.
makes this very very contemporary.
But it's also maybe this sort of, I don't know if you would call that a postmodernist idea, but this sort of exposing the artifice, instead of trying
Yeah,
to make things look as convincing as possible, you're sort of showing us that this is something that's created. This is something that, was made for you, and you're
yeah.
leaving those traces of the process in there. Yeah.
And then again, it ties back to abstractionism, because
Mm.
abstractionism is about, look, a painting is just paint on a
Right.
canvas.
Right. Right.
That's it. It's an artifice.
Yeah.
It's just a paint on a canvas. It's about composition and all of that. So don't worry. It's just that. Just enjoy the colors.
Yeah.
And he does that a lot with his paintings. And when you mentioned the shadows that don't make sense on the
Mm-hmm.
pulpit, that
Mm-hmm.
it's black there but for no reason.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very that again ties a lot back to the abstract movement of just like it's there because it visually, aesthetically, it makes sense, but it
Right.
doesn't need to convey anything. It's just to balance the picture.
Yeah. And you mentioned this briefly that he sort of flattens out the image, but I mean, if we were to say a little bit more about why exactly this looks so flat, a lot of that has to do with the way he uses colors. Like he's not sort of the value range of the foreground is pretty much exactly the same as the value range of the background, and so everything feels as if it's on the same plane. There's nothing that gets sort of a lot lighter as it goes further away, for instance. And so that's what he's doing there, and that is, I think, really that's also part of what makes it feel so impactful. I think that is kind of all up in your face. There is, if you look at what's in there, there is kind of space there, right, between the Virgin Mary and the angels, but it all feels like everything's sort of pressed up against you as the viewer, and that makes it sort of a very sort of intense painting to look at.
And I think you just touched another point, pressed against the viewer, right? All in the same plane, pressed against the viewer. That's something that Cubism was concerned about, right? Just everything in the same plane and kind of against the viewer as well, so that we could see everything from all the angles in just the same surface. So then again, it's all, but that was all in the 20th century, and this guy, he was working in the 16th century, right?
Yeah.
So
and I mean,
4 centuries before, if my math doesn't fail me.
And of course, it's one of those things that's interesting to think about is, how much of that is, him. Is it because he wasn't as thoroughly trained as some other painters, and then he just sort of figured out a way for himself to do it, or did he have these sort of very sort of forward-looking ideas about image making? But I think it's definitely, El Greco is definitely an example of somebody who may or may not have been a very respected figure in his own time, but has definitely come in for reevaluation because he does a lot of what he does sort of jives with later art movements and their concerns, right?
Absolutely.
And with good reason, I think, when you look at a painting like this.
Yeah. And also I have a theory.
Yes.
I have a theory about why he did that, because he's Greek. Right? And in Greece, there was still parts of the Byzantine Empire. Am I correct?
At this point, maybe
because there was the Orthodox Church.
Yes, there was the Orthodox Church and the icons and so forth. Definitely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the Orthodox Church, as far as I know, is a reminiscence of the Byzantine Empire. Right?
Yeah.
And the Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantine Church, like the Orthodox Church, they developed parallel to the Catholic Church, so they developed their own ways of depicting pictures, slightly different, and it was more iconic, more flat.
Yeah, to be sure.
Right. Yes. For example, Gustav Klimt, the 19th century painter, he was very inspired by the Byzantine art, and his pictures were more flat. His paintings were a bit more flat. So maybe that's why El Greco would make these paintings that were more flat and more disconnected with the main European way of portraying, and maybe more connected with the Greek traditions. I don't know. I think that's putting it out there.
Yeah, I think that's a good theory, to be sure. I buy it. I buy that. By the way, I was just Googling, and the Byzantine Empire sort of ended around 100 years before this painting was made, but that, of course, does not mean that El Greco wouldn't have been influenced by the traditions, And it doesn't mean that art just changed overnight because the Byzantine Empire stopped existing. So definitely.
Yeah.
All right. I guess that's what we have to say about the
I
Annunciation
think
by
so.
Dominicus Theotokopoulos, aka El Greco.